Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first Content Law Pathway lecture. It's a very great honour that we have our first celebrity on the pre-sessional delivering a lecture this week. Peter Tatchell is a very well-known name in this country for the campaigning work that he does. He is a British human rights campaigner, originally from Australia, best known for his work with LGBT social movements. He's been Labour Party parliamentary candidate for Bermondsey in 1983, and in the 1990s he campaigned for LGBT rights through the direct action group Outrage, which he co-founded. He's worked on various campaigns such as Stop Murder Music, against music lyrics inciting violence against LGBT people, and writes and broadcasts on various human rights and social justice issues. In 1999 and in 2001, he attempted a citizen's arrest of Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe, one of his finest moments, I think. In April 2004, he joined the Green Party of England and Wales, and in 2007 was selected as prospective parliamentary candidate in the constituency of Oxford East. So it's my very great pleasure to introduce to you Peter Tatchell. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The theme today is the limits of human rights law. So I'm sure you know that in a reaction to the horrors of Nazism during the Second World War, it was resolved through the newly formed United Nations to create a body of human rights law to prevent such atrocities ever happening again, or at least to minimize the chances of them happening by placing constraints on what governments could do. So the principle was that no government, whatever its mandate, should have the right to violate human rights. And after the Second World War, with the formation of the United Nations, the first major document was, of course, the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was promulgated in 1948. It set out the rights of citizens and the constraints on government. And it was followed up by subsequent human rights conventions, such as the Genocide Convention, outlawing genocide, also legislated in 1948. The following year came the Geneva Conventions, criminalizing war crimes, and then later a whole series of other human rights conventions, such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention Against Torture, and in the late 1990s, the Rome Treaty, which created the International Criminal Court. So we've had this body of human rights law for many decades. The big problem is that it has a number of constraints and limitations. So, for example, none of those conventions explicitly protect the human rights of disabled people or people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. And that is, I suppose, partly because in that era, when those conventions were written, there was no general recognition and consensus about the rights of disabled and LGBT people. Even the European Convention on Human Rights, which was agreed in 1950, does not include any explicit, specific protections for people with disabilities and for people on the grounds of their sexual orientation and gender identity. What has happened, but only in the recent decades, really last 2 decades, is that these human rights conventions have progressively been interpreted to cover disability, sexuality, and gender identity. So the clause in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that guarantees equal treatment and protection against discrimination has been interpreted by the United Nations as covering sexual orientation and gender identity, the rights of disabled people, and so on. So there's been progress, but it's been based on interpretation, not on explicit statement in those conventions. The other big issue is that, certainly in people's minds, human rights largely revolves around issues of liberty and equality. So the right to protest or the right to strike, freedom of expression, the right to life, the right to hold dissenting, disagreeable views. Those are what most people see as human rights. But in fact, human rights has been progressively expanded to include a much wider remit. So with the passage of the United Nations Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, it was established that human rights include the right to adequate food and clean water, to speak your own language, to celebrate your own culture, the right to shelter and education, the right to basic health care. These are enshrined in the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Convention as also being human rights. Yet often, of course, they are not accepted and not acted upon by very many countries in the world. Another issue that is enshrined is the right of nations to self-determination, which goes very much beyond traditional notions of human rights. So the right, for example, of the people of Tibet to determine their own future. The right of the people of Balochistan, which is an occupied region of Pakistan, to determine their own future. The right of the people of West Papua, which is occupied by Indonesia, to determine their own future. These are also human rights. But of course, as we know, they are widely ignored. There are 30 or 40 annexed and occupied nations around the world who are being suppressed by oppressor nations who have been denied the right to determine their own future. And under United Nations Charter, the right to self-determination is a fundamental national and human right. And to those nations who hold other nations in subjugation, the United Nations says that all these nations should have a right to have a referendum, a free vote by their people, to decide if they want to remain part of the greater, bigger nation. So, for example, when Indonesia annexed West Papua, the western half of New Guinea, in 1969, the people there were denied a free vote. The Indonesians handpicked 1,000 tribal leaders and forced them at gunpoint to sign over that they would become part of Indonesia. And to this day, the people of West Papua are simply saying, we want a right to vote to whether to stay part of Indonesia, to be an autonomous province, or to be independent. And so far, all the opinion polls indicate the majority of the West Papuan people want independence. Of course, when we look at the enforcement of human rights, we can see that it is very, very patchy. It's great to have these laws and these conventions, but so often they are defied and ignored by many member states. So we have a situation where countries may commit gross human rights abuses in violation of United Nations conventions which they have signed and they have pledged to uphold, and there's nothing the international community can do. Sometimes there are sanctions, but sometimes these sanctions are indiscriminate, and ordinary people, rather than the leaders and the regime, suffer, as happened in Iraq many years ago. The sanctions against Iraq have very much hit ordinary Iraqis, rather than targeting the Saddam Hussein regime specifically. So this is a really big problem, and we've seen it very dramatically in Syria in the last few years. Quite clearly, there are massive human rights abuses going on in Syria under the Bashar al-Assad regime. It's very well documented, the scale of torture and executions by that regime. Quite clearly in contravention to the United Nations Convention Against Torture and against the conventions which prohibit extrajudicial killings and executions without due process and fair trial. Many of you have seen the thousands of images of torture which were smuggled out, and the testimonies of former regime leaders in Syria who have spoken about their eyewitness accounts of mass torture and executions. Likewise, the Assad regime and its Russian allies have been, and still are today, indiscriminately bombing civilian areas, which is clearly and categorically against the Geneva Conventions, which prohibit indiscriminate attacks upon civilian populated areas, and specifically prohibit the attacks on civilian housing, places of worship, schools, and cultural centers, all of which have been bombed by the Assad and Putin regimes. Now, what surprises me is that despite all the limits of human rights law, the International Criminal Court has not issued international arrest warrants for President Assad, his key henchmen, and indeed some of the rebels, in particular al-Nusra Front and ISIS, who have also committed war crimes. Why have those international arrest warrants not been issued? Because they could be. And I and others have been campaigning for years to get them to issue these arrest warrants. So there's a lot of geopolitics holding back the International Criminal Court, plus, of course, it is underfunded, understaffed, and under-resourced. But quite clearly, that is something the International Criminal Court could have and should have done: issue international arrest warrants for leading members of the Assad regime and, for that matter, the Russian regime, the ISIS and other Islamist organizations who also committed war crimes. They haven't done so. The other question, of course, is that Syrian democratic and civil society organizations have been saying for a long time that the UN should mandate the enforcement of United Nations no-fly or no-bomb zones across civilian areas, should impose an arms embargo on any arms for any side going into Syria, should establish humanitarian corridors for aid relief, should create civilian safe havens, and even send in United Nations peacekeepers. The United Nations has been stymied because in the Security Council, Russia and sometimes China keep on vetoing any action. These proposals are not about Western intervention, they're about United Nations action to protect civilian populations. Not to take one side or the other, but just to protect the civilian population. But nothing has been done because one or two countries in the Security Council keep on vetoing action. And in the Security Council, you need to have a unanimous view for action to be taken. But, and there's a big but, there is a way around this, which myself and others have been arguing, again for several years. In 1950, the United Nations passed Resolution 377A, called Uniting for Peace. And under this resolution, it empowers the United Nations General Assembly to mandate action, even if one or more members of the Security Council veto it. So again, the question is, why hasn't this resolution been used to mandate a no-bomb zone, civilian safe havens, and so on in Syria? It is a massive, monumental failure by the United Nations and the international community. Another big problem with international human rights law is the way it is often selectively enforced. So we've seen the leaders of countries like Rwanda, Liberia, and the former Yugoslavia being indicted by international courts under the auspices of the United Nations. And quite rightly. You know, Charles Taylor of Liberia was responsible for mass murder in his country. Slobodan Milosevic, the president of Serbia, was responsible for the mass indiscriminate killing of people, particularly in Muslim majority areas. And they were taken to court, and they were prosecuted, I think Charles Taylor got 20 plus years. Slobodan Milosevic unfortunately died before a verdict could be agreed. But it is very selective. These are relatively minor human rights abuses. The big ones have got away with it. So there is an arguable case in international law that George W. Bush, the former US president, could have and still should be prosecuted for authorizing extraordinary rendition, which means kidnapping and taking of people to Guantanamo Bay where they were subjected to torture, contrary to the United Nations Convention Against Torture. The question is, why wasn't George W. Bush prosecuted? If they can prosecute Charles Taylor, why not George W. Bush? Likewise, when it comes to the conflict between Israel and Palestine, it is very clear that successive Israeli premiers, Ariel Sharon and Benjamin Netanyahu, have authorized indiscriminate attacks upon civilian areas, most notably in Gaza. Now, of course, Israel in every country has a right to self-defense, but it has to be proportionate. And what we know from all the evidence we have is that many of the Israeli attacks upon Gaza hit civilian areas and primarily killed civilian peoples. And that is, again, it's quite clearly a war crime under the Geneva Conventions, but no prosecution. Then you look at Russia and Vladimir Putin. Just look what he has done in Chechnya in the 1990s, then later in Georgia, the Ukraine and Crimea. Wholesale interventions against other nations' sovereignty, the commission of war crimes, the indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas, the killing of prisoners, torture. Why has Vladimir Putin never been prosecuted by the International Criminal Court? It shows the failings, not of the principles, but of the mechanisms for enforcement. And lest you think I'm pointing the finger too far away, why wasn't the British Prime Minister James Callaghan and his successor Margaret Thatcher prosecuted for human rights abuses in the north of Ireland? Because the British state, and the British Army in particular, committed atrocities, including torture and extrajudicial killings, during the conflict in the north of Ireland. Quite clearly contrary to both British and international human rights law, but neither of those prime ministers were ever prosecuted. So what I'm trying to do is highlight the selectivity of the way in which human rights law is enforced. It was mentioned that I twice attempted a citizen's arrest of President Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe. The first time was in 1999 in London, and the second time in 2001 in Brussels. And this attempt to arrest him was on the basis that he had authorized, condoned, and acquiesced in acts of torture. You'll remember that many years ago, and even sometimes occasionally today, opposition activists and civil rights campaigners in Zimbabwe are arrested and tortured by the Zimbabwe police and military intelligence. In 1999, I was given evidence that Robert Mugabe had personally authorized the torture of 2 black journalists in Harare, Zimbabwe. They worked for the Standard newspaper. He had boasted of their torture and said they were lucky they didn't get even worse. No apology, a tacit admission that he had authorized it, and indeed the interrogators admitted openly that the orders came directly from him as the president. So quite clearly contrary to the United Nations Convention Against Torture. I was asked by Zimbabwean activists to try and do something. So I hit on the idea of using the Convention Against Torture, which has actually been incorporated into British law. It is part of British law now, as well as being international law, and the power of citizen's arrest. In this country and most countries, any private citizen has the right to arrest a person if they believe, if they've got prima facie evidence, that they have committed a crime or are about to commit a crime. So I had the evidence that President Mugabe had committed the crime of torture. He had authorized it. That was the commissioning of that act of torture. So I got a late night tip-off that he was staying in St James's Court Hotel near Victoria Station in London, and decided to lay in wait outside his hotel to try and arrest him. I took 4 colleagues with me, plus a journalist, a photographer, and a video person. And we turned up really early one morning, assuming he would come out of the hotel at some point, and then we were going to arrest him. In the end, what happened was that we were laying in wait for, we started at 8:30, by 10:30 he still hadn't showed, and we were trying to look inconspicuous, but the concierge from the hotel, the guy who wears the top hat and tails and greets guests, because this is a very, very posh hotel, started looking at us, and he's obviously twigged that we'd been there for a couple of hours, and then a little bit later, 5, all I say is African-looking guys, came out from the side vehicle entrance where the VIP apartments are, and started looking and pointing in our direction. So I thought to myself, phew, they're obviously suspicious of us. And first of all, I thought that this probably does mean he's in the hotel, because up to this point, I was acting on an anonymous tip-off. I didn't know he was in the hotel. But I thought, these probably are Mugabe's bodyguards and security team. This probably means he's in the hotel. If they are suspicious, he won't come out, or they will call the police. And given all the things that I've done over the years, as soon as the police know it's me, we'll all be arrested. So I had to think on my feet, which is very difficult, because you're very nervous in this. We're trying to arrest a president. And they armed bodyguards. This is really serious stuff. So I was shaking like a leaf. But anyway, I suddenly had a brainwave. I walked over to these bodyguards and said, "Oh, hi guys, I'm from the News of the World." For those who don't know, the News of the World is a very prominent tabloid newspaper. It used to exist, doesn't exist anymore. I said, "I'm from the News of the World, and these are my photographers, my video person, and my journalistic colleagues. We're here because we have heard that Elton John is in the hotel with his new boyfriend, and we've got to get the story to tomorrow's paper." Of course, Elton John wasn't in the hotel, I just made that up. So they sort of shook their heads. I said, "I'll give you £50 if you tell us which room he's in." And so I was trying to throw them off the scent, you see, to make them feel that there's no threat to Mugabe. "I'll give you £50. I'll give you £75. I'll give you £100. I only had £10 in my pocket. Anyway, none of that worked. Then suddenly I had another idea. I turned to one of them. I said, "I know you. You can't fool me. You are part of Elton John's security detail, because I saw you at the Wembley concert 2 months ago." There was no Wembley concert 2 months ago. They didn't know that. And this guy shook his head, and he burst out laughing, and they all started joking. Then they walked off. And I thought, that might have convinced them. And sure enough, 10 minutes later, out from the side entrance came President Mugabe in his big limousine. I scratched the top of my head to indicate that he was in the car, and my 3 colleagues ran straight out in front of his speeding limousine, and it screeched to a halt about 6 to 9 inches from their legs. Then one ran behind the car, so it couldn't move forward and couldn't move backward. I ran from the side, opened the left-hand rear door. Amazingly, it was unlocked, and there before me was President Mugabe, the president of Zimbabwe. I leaned in and gently took his arm with this hand, then held up this hand to show I didn't have a weapon, and then said, "President Mugabe, you're under arrest. You're under arrest on charges of torture. Torture is a crime under international law. I am now summoning the police." You should have seen the look on his face. He is very dark-skinned, but a visible ashen pallor came across his face. His eyes popped, his jaw dropped. He held up his hands, he pulled his hand away from mine like this, like he looked like a frightened 10-year-old kid. To which I thought, now you know what your victims feel like. And we aren't going to kill or torture you. We're going to take you to a court of law, and you'll have a chance to defend yourself. So we did summons the police. The police came. They were gobsmacked when we said it was the president of Zimbabwe in the car. And we gave them all the evidence, the papers showing torture and the affidavits from the victims. They knocked it out of our hands. We were arrested, and President Mugabe was given a police escort to go Christmas shopping at Harrods. So he got away. But, you know, again, while we were under detention in Belgravia police station, the British Foreign Secretary and the Attorney General could have and should have authorised Mugabe's arrest and trial on charges of torture, because the evidence was overwhelming. We had the affidavits, the statements, everything. but they decided to let him go. And a similar thing happened in Brussels in 2001. Again, I got a tip-off that Mugabe was going to Brussels. This time, I couldn't find any colleagues to go with me. It was only a day or so's notice. So I decided to do it myself. So I lay in wait in the lobby of the Hilton Hotel, where I knew from a tip-off that he was due to meet one of the European commissioners. I knew he'd have to come out because he had a meeting at 3 p.m. with the Belgian Prime Minister at his private residence. So I lay in the hotel lobby, again with a plan to try and arrest him as he came through. And so I busied myself near the exit of the lobby in a boutique that was selling ties and scarves and things like that. But I positioned myself so I was looking away from the lift area from where Mugabe's entourage would come, but I could see them in the plate glass window. So the reflection of the plate glass window, because I thought if they saw my face, they might have been in the previous incident in London, or Mugabe himself probably would recognize me. So that's why I had to sort of not let them see my face at the last minute. So as they came out through the hotel lobby, I waited almost parallel to the boutique where I was in, and then I stumbled out like a clumsy tourist into the middle of his entourage. And at first they just thought I was a clumsy tourist. And then I beamed and said, "President Mugabe, I'm so pleased to meet you," smiling and offering my hand. Again, they thought I was a well-wisher, so they took no action. So I got really close to him before they suddenly realized, it's Tatchell. And then I was grabbed, dragged off to the corner, and beaten around the head. You can see the videos on YouTube. Eventually, then the remaining bodyguards rushed Mugabe into the big revolving door to exit the hotel. And half a dozen of them piled in with him and tried to push the door, and it got stuck. So he was stuck in the revolving door. So the bodyguards who were trying to get out of the revolving door screamed to the bodyguards who were beating me up, "Come and unrelease the door." So they did, and then I ran out the side fire exit into the street and faced Mugabe on the other side of the revolving door, screaming at the top of my voice, "Mugabe, murderer, Mugabe, torturer, arrest Mugabe." Then I was seized by the Belgian Secret Service. They slammed me up against the plate glass window. Meanwhile, Mugabe's entourage got out of the revolving door and then came over and started beating me in front of all these TV cameras. And at one point they knocked me on the ground, and then journalists started asking, "Who are you? On whose authority are you attacking this man?" And while they were distracted, I scampered between their legs and ran out into the driveway just as Mugabe's limousine was leaving, and ran right in front of it. And again, it stopped just a few inches from my legs. Then the big heavy guys got out, and I was actually beaten unconscious by them. Again, I did not succeed. Even though Belgium has signed the Convention Against Torture, even though I sent that morning all the evidence from Mugabe's arrest to the Belgian Justice Ministry and the Foreign Ministry, they ignored it. So I didn't succeed, but through those two actions, which got masses of global media publicity, it did help raise awareness about Mugabe's crimes. And from the messages I got back from people inside Zimbabwe, it was a great morale boost that someone at least tried to get him, because he was untouchable in Zimbabwe. So that's a bit of a detour. I later on in 2004 did a legal case in Bow Street Magistrates Court to get an international arrest warrant for Mugabe. I came very close, but in the end the magistrate said that he did not believe that I had the wherewithal to secure a successful prosecution. It was a bit of a cop-out, really. But the main reason was he said that as a head of state, President Mugabe has immunity from prosecution. And this has been a tradition going back 100 years. Governments always say that other heads of state have immunity from prosecution. And their reasoning is, if they say that and they all say that, then they can all move freely around the world. But if you establish the principle the heads of state didn't have immunity, then any time a questionable head of state moved to another country, they could potentially be arrested and put on trial. And because all these world leaders are in it together, they're all part of a big club, they want to protect each other's backs. So they stick to this principle: you can't prosecute a head of state. Now, that was changed in 1998 with the Rome Treaty, which established the criminal court, the International Criminal Court. I think if I remember, it's Article 25 specifically states that a head of state does not have immunity from the crimes covered by the Rome Treaty, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, torture, and so on. But the magistrate wouldn't buy that, so he refused to issue the arrest warrant. I also tried to use international human rights law to get Henry Kissinger, the former US Secretary of State, arrested in 2002. This was over his authorization of the mass indiscriminate bombing of Cambodia in the 1970s, when hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed by carpet bombing civilian populated areas by the US Air Force. And again, it's very, very clear, a clear contravention of the Geneva Conventions against war crimes. In that case, the magistrate agreed that I had established a strong case for an arrest warrant. But he had two questions. One was, he doubted my ability to finance and fund the bringing to Britain of key witnesses from the former witnesses or former members of the US National Security Agency, the CIA, and so on. Either that I couldn't fund them or they wouldn't come. But the other question he raised is, he did say to me, well, at one point, are you seriously suggesting that I should issue this warrant and have the former US Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, locked up in Pentonville Prison, which is a major prison in London, and a very tough one? To which I was prepared. I said, well, no, sir, I accept that this is, but that would be perhaps a step too far. But I have here a list of residences. I'm told that Henry Kissinger is very partial to the Oxfordshire countryside. So maybe he could be held under house arrest in one of these premises, which of course is what happened with General Pinochet. Pinochet was not put in prison, he was held under house arrest while the British government umd-and-ahed and eventually let him go. To which the magistrate had a good giggle, but ultimately the attempt was turned down. But I think, again, the legal case against Henry Kissinger under international law is absolutely right. There are so many examples of instances where war crimes are not being prosecuted. So for many years I've supported the right of self-determination of the people of Balochistan, which is one of the provinces of Pakistan. It was an independent nation. It became an independent nation in 1947, and the following year, 1948, the Pakistan military invaded, annexed, and have occupied it ever since. Quite clearly that is against the United Nations Charter and the right to self-determination. And the Pakistan government always says, well, the people want to be part of Pakistan, to which the Balochistan people say, well, give us a referendum. If you think the people of Balochistan want to be part of Pakistan, let them vote and let them decide. But of course, the Pakistan government won't do that because it knows most of them don't want to be. And the same as I mentioned with Indonesia's annexation of West Papua in 1969. Many of you will be perhaps familiar historically with the war crimes committed by Sudan in the Darfur region about 10 to 20 years ago. Again, mass wholesale killings, orchestrated starvation, deprivation of food, quite clearly war crimes and crimes against humanity, but the Sudanese leader, Omar al-Bashir, has never, ever been arrested. When it comes to the issue of the head of state immunity, as I mentioned, the International Criminal Court had agreed, it's actually Article 27, I'm corrected, Article 27 of the Rome Treaty states that heads of state do not have immunity. But even before then, it was accepted that this was the case. So, for example, in the Nuremberg trials of Nazi leaders, it was accepted then that heads of state should not have immunity. And those heads of states and other leaders were prosecuted at Nuremberg despite pleading head of state and high government immunity. Likewise, President Slobodan Milosevic, he was indicted and put on trial, or indicted for trial, while he was still president of Yugoslavia. and Charles Taylor was also indicted while he was president of Liberia. So the argument that heads of state have immunity is really not tenable. It doesn't stand up, and it quite clearly no longer should hold sway, even though so many governments still insist that it does. Very briefly, go back to the Iraq War. Many of the coalition forces bombings in the first Iraq War on the road to Basra, a wholesale slaughter, without any attempt to get Iraqi forces to surrender, a wholesale slaughter of thousands and thousands of people on the road to Basra. During the second Iraq War, again in the town of Fallujah, a mass indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas, quite clearly a crime for which the United States should be held responsible. In Yemen today, Saudi Arabia is also indiscriminately bombing civilian areas. It's using illegal cluster weapons, which are banned under international law. But again, no action is being taken. Really, really big problem. I'll just finish by saying some ideas about what needs or could perhaps happen to help resolve some of these issues. The first is I think we need a new United Nations International Human Rights Convention, a comprehensive United Nations International Human Rights Convention, setting out all the different human rights principles that are embodied in all the different conventions written up over the years. And that this should be enforceable in both national and international courts, so that people shouldn't have to necessarily go to the Hague Court or the International Criminal Court or special tribunals. They should be able to action them in their own country or in the country of another state. So, for example, you're not going to get the Russian courts to put President Putin on trial for human rights abuses in Chechnya in the 1990s, in the Ukraine or Crimea, or in Syria today. But it ought to be possible for a court in India, a court in South Africa, a court in Britain to hold that trial, if necessary, in absentia. And I think, although it wouldn't have the mechanism for enforcement, a conviction would send a very powerful signal, not only to the person who had abused human rights, but to others who may contemplate abusing human rights. And we know that there are instances where some people in some regimes have held back from some of the worst excesses precisely because they fear potential eventual prosecution. The other development which would be useful would be the creation of a permanent UN enforcement agency. I'm not talking about necessarily military powers, but certainly peacekeeping powers. A multinational force, not a Western force, but a multinational force that will be able to go into trouble spots to try and diffuse conflicts, to keep warring parties apart, and to protect civilian populations. But there may even be a case for having those forces to have military strength and power. And certainly in Rwanda and Democratic Republic of the Congo and so on, where there have been external forces, albeit of a very limited and partial nature, it has probably, and I say probably, not certainly, but probably saved considerable numbers of civilian lives. So that's certainly worth exploring. But I suppose that the key thing is to create a global public consciousness and a global public demand across borders, irrespective of a nation's politics or whatever, to get this sense that the global consensus is that these human rights abuses are not acceptable and that leaders should be held to account when they violate human rights. And not selectively, but universally. That there be comprehensive enforcement against all human rights abusers, not just the small and weak, but the big and powerful as well, in absentia, if necessary. So I'll finish there and just leave you with my motto, which is, don't accept the world as it is, dream of what the world could be, and then help make it happen. Thank you.